Yose shalom emumaf. Yose shalom aleinu ve'achol Israel ve'emu amen. Yase shalom, Yase shalom, shalom aleinu ve'achol Israel. Yase shalom, Yase shalom, shalom aleinu ve'achol Israel.
Their history as a people began about 1900 BCE with Abraham. They believe in a God who gave them the Torah, a divine moral compass for how mankind should live. They as a people crossed the paths of many civilizations, a people known to the world as Jews.
Yase shalom, shalom aleinu ve'achol
The question as to who Jews are really the people of the first monotheistic religion. We believe in one God. How we believe in one God has evolved over the years from the days of Abraham. And that's really where we are now in what is a communal religious building called a synagogue.
Christianity had risen to become the dominant religion. Eager to preserve wealth, power, and influence, the political and religious leaders claimed everything else to be dangerous heresy. They devised a plan to unite the population under one crown and one religion.
The Roman Empire, even before the time of Jesus, as far back as 143 BC, when the then Praetorian Hispanus by name issued an edict commanding all Jews who are not then citizens of Rome to leave the territory. We then see this pattern of expulsions being repeated throughout the next couple of centuries, coming down to England in 1290 under King Edward I, who issues what is then known as the Edict of Expulsion, with similar wording demanding that all Jews leave the country. Over the ensuing 200 years between that edict and the emergence of Columbus on the scene in 1492, we see these waves and bubbles of anti-Jewish sentiment involving very harsh rhetoric, expulsion orders, and of course physical attacks.
There are two major activities, one in my lifetime and one 500 years ago. The one 500 years ago was the expulsion from Spain by all the Jews and the Moors by Ferdinand and Isabella. What happens is that Islam controlled Spain for close to 700 years, or over 700 years. The first major programs started in Seville in 1391, and people converted to Christianity, etc. The whole concept of the Christian return to the whole of Spain is called the Reconquista. And the Reconquista ends with the Battle of Granada, when the Moors are returned to the northern Africa. And so that time, what takes place is that Ferdinand and Isabella are the king and queen. A guy named Torquemada manages to persuade them that the grandees are not going to be of any value to them. And so the context of the expulsion takes place. So Jews are expelled from Spain. It wasn't a question of you were a nice guy, you could stay. If you were a practicing Jew, go.
These issues caused much turmoil for the Jews. They were often forced to flee, but wherever they moved and settled, their intellect and their insistence on supporting each other created sizable communities, even if they were never permanent. Another Jewish settlement was disrupted when the bloody Inquisition was set in motion to maintain Catholic orthodoxy.
If you stayed in Spain and practiced now as a converted Jew to Christianity, a converso, you were then subject to the test of faith. auto da fe, as it was known, which was practiced in the period in which there was called an inquisition. So, if you lit candles on a Friday night, you could be questioned as to your religious beliefs, and you could be subject to everything, including death. And this practice took place in the Spanish, Christian, Catholic world all the way up into the 1860s in Mexico.
They noticed the rising economic power of the Jewish community, and they wanted to find a way to appropriate those resources without having to go through any real legalities or any other complications. So they decided on these religious tests and the tests of faith to subject the Jews to as much persecution and to impose as much terror as possible on the community so that they could then move in and take resources from them. So a key part of that imposition of the will was the use of torture. We see a lot of devices that would have come out of the medieval era that would have been continued into the late 1400s, which is when the Inquisition started. First of all, there was the rack, which essentially, as the name implies, was just a horizontal bed on which the victim was placed. The hands were tied, usually above the head. The knees or the feet were tied and weighted, and it was connected to a lever or a winch. And as the interrogation proceeded, the winch would be turned, the victim would be stretched out by both arms and legs. And then added to that, you had what was called the strappado, or the strap, which essentially was the rack become a vertical device. So the hands would be tied behind the back of the victim, and again the legs or ankles would be weighted, and you would be connected to a lever that would turn. You would have eventual dislocation, or many times the limbs being torn off.
With pending expulsion orders and the ongoing horrors of Inquisition, the Jews faced an issue of survival.
All Jewish people, some 200,000 of them, had to leave Spain.
The vast majority fled back into the Mediterranean from the expulsion, the day of expulsion in 1492. And they went into Turkey, they went into Morocco, they went into Greece. Don't ask me, that's not the question. The question is that about 30,000 or more fled to Portugal.
They were accommodated by the King of Portugal and only became threatened again when the King Ferdinand and his wife had a daughter who was supposed to marry the King of Portugal.
And they said, you can't if you don't get rid of the Jews. So to get rid of the Jews, he didn't kick them out, he didn't give them an expulsion notice. He rounded them up in the streets of Portugal, of the cities and the villages of Portugal, and forcibly baptized them. So they became baptized as Catholic. And he then declared to Ferdinand and Isabella, I've got rid of all the Jews.
And so the whole problem of the conversion to Christianity and Catholicism became something that was forced again.
It was really quite a clever way of taking away people's assets. If you condemn them, persecute them, and find out what's important to them and force them to give it up, which is the religion, or give up their assets.
It was a very chaotic period. They got little and nothing for the property that they had. They had to sell it as fast as possible, and they had to take whatever bid they could get. There was a rumor in Spain at the time also that the Jews, in leaving with their jewels, they would swallow the jewels. And so they were also the victims of many attacks where they were cut open. A number of Jews scrambled, got on some of the ships. But it so happened that the ships that sailed from Spain went into the middle of the ocean, and some of the Jews were dumped in the middle of the ocean.
While there still remains much speculation about the origins of the famous and controversial explorer, most scholars today dismiss the rather poignant efforts to Judaize Columbus. They instead prefer to focus on the thoroughly documented role of the Jews in the great mariner's voyages of discovery.
He was financed, to the best of our knowledge, by conversos, wealthy conversos, grandees, who were allowed to stay in Spain without too much problem, giving support to what Ferdinand and Isabella also needed, which was money. The people who would have accompanied Columbus's sail voyages and were known to be Jews were really probably conversos. Maybe there were one or two Anusim, but that I think came somewhat later, mainly in Portugal. Anusim really means the forced ones. So part of the story is that the conversos were Anusim. They were forced to convert to Catholicism, which is what really happened more so in Portugal by the story of Manuel wishing to marry Isabella and Ferdinand's daughter. They were forced to baptize in the streets of Portugal and became conversos. Were Jews allowed in the New World? And the answer is no. Did they come to settle in Jamaica? And the answer is, as conversos or even Anusim, yes. Did they practice Judaism in Jamaica for the period of the Spanish colonial period of, 160 odd years? The answer is, to the best of our knowledge and from the research that we have, no. They did not practice Judaism.
The Jewish people have always been dispersed before, of course, a homeland was found in Israel. And this dispersal has been good and bad. The method of dispersal has been extremely traumatic, right, to the Jewish people. But there are certain areas of where they have been dispersed that they have really been welcomed, been part of the community, and we are allowed to grow up their families and to prosper. The Caribbean is one such place, and Jamaica is also one such place.
To find out this land has really, it's a wealth of Jewish history for Jamaica and for the Caribbean.
Perpetuity was cut short in 1655 when an English fleet led by Admirals Penn and Venables succeeded in capturing Jamaica, assuming full control of the island by 1658. But why did the English want Jamaica? And what place did the Jews have under English control?
The English history, as it relates to Jamaica, took place under Cromwell, not under the monarchy. When the English captured Jamaica, it was primarily because of the massive harbor that Kingston enjoys. Kingston Harbor is the 7th largest in the world. And so with the protection that the English built to stop foreign ships coming into Kingston Harbor, this was what attracted Jews to the major public works and of course the business of the capture of the Spanish fleets by the buccaneers, who were licensed by the English. The Jews were allowed to settle in Jamaica from elsewhere for the economic opportunities created by the English creating the fortifications of Kingston Harbor to protect the harbor, first and foremost. And as a safe harbor, Port Royal became the major entrepot of the New World.
When the British colonized Jamaica, the Jews were actually given equal status at one point. It was taken away, it was negotiated back. I think that having fled persecution, they understood what it was like to be marginalized and persecuted.
We were not allowed to undertake all the positions that the British had for their own subjects. We were artisans, we were saddle makers, we were horse trainers, and we also started to get involved in medical practices, in legal, becoming lawyers.
Life for the Jews in Jamaica was nothing like their ancestors experienced in Europe. But like any society, there still existed a social hierarchy. And though they were no longer facing persecution, the Jews in Jamaica were not at the top of the social pyramid.
So even though Jamaica, of course, became a place of both refuge and tolerance in the main for the Jewish people, beginning with the English occupation, we still find, of course, that the Inquisition is a threat, it's a fear, it's something that the community would have in their mind, that it is almost on their doorstep. And in addition to that, there is still the continuation of anti-Jewish sentiment in a different form within what is, even at that time, a dynamic society in Jamaica. You have slaves, you have a very small portion of free blacks, you have the planter class, and you have essentially, of course, the Jews kind of still being caught between the powers, because the struggle never really ceases between the major powers trying to establish themselves. You have a number of naval battles that were fought within the region. So there is a continuing air of uncertainty, even as they do manage to build up their own wealth and their own sort of standing.
I'd want to emphasize that full civil rights during slavery was reserved for males who were white, who were Protestant, and had property. So if you're a poor white, even though you're a Protestant, you didn't qualify for civil rights. The Jews were clearly not Protestant, okay, although they were considered white in terms of phenotype, okay. The elite Jews certainly owned property, some were extensive merchants, okay, who invested over time in plantations as well. Others were authorities for significant absentee planters. But fundamentally, they were discriminated against on the grounds of religion. And the white planter class were concerned about the possibilities of growing wealth among the Jewish fraternity, but also it was ingrained prejudice, ethnic prejudice against Jews. It was a primarily English planting class. And over time, more Scots came, Irish came, but they brought with them their traditional prejudices.
Consequent to these prejudices, a number of restrictions were devised for the planter class to maintain control and limit the wealth the Jews could accumulate. They did have some success with these restrictions, at least for a little while.
Prior to the freedom of being recognized as full citizens of 1831, we were restricted from participating in government activity. We couldn't be employed for a number of different responsibilities. We couldn't be elected to the legislature. So these were some of the restrictive aspects of it.
Do you find that the governments of the day decide that really take notice of the Jewish uplift and decide that, well, okay, we have to kind of put some sort of measures in place against it? You find people lobbying for taxation, for levies, for various means of extracting revenue where they know that it exists within the Jewish community.
Because of being merchants, it was presumed by the British that we were, in fact, competing with the British merchants. And there were even protests to Whitehall on that matter.
And this continues right through the 17th and 18th centuries even as the abolition movement gathers steam, of course aided and abetted by very violent slave revolts in Jamaica and in other places throughout the Caribbean.
When the movement to abolish slavery started, the Jews in Jamaica, who at that time controlled something like 17% of the wealth and the commerce in the island, realized that they would be disadvantaged to the slaves when they became free, and that the abolition of slavery that was granted in 1833 was going to put them in a disadvantaged position when it finally came about in 38, and that these slaves would be in a better legal position. They wouldn't have any restrictions on them that the Jews would still have. So they started to petition England. And in 1831, England removed all the disabilities and the restrictions on the Jews in Jamaica, only in Jamaica. And in fact, arguably that is the thing that started the movement for the Jews in other parts of the world to start to try and get the restrictions against them. And when you realize that in England it didn't happen until 1858, 27 years later, you realize how advanced Jamaica was.
Another group of Jews, not merchants, not extensive property owners, but primarily retailers and shopkeepers, wholesalers and retailers, liquor retailers, food retailers, dry goods retailers, some combining all activity in one, who established strong commercial links with the new class of freed people. They set up businesses in important market towns. Some were market towns from during the period of enslavement, areas like Chapelton, Old Harbor Market, Falmouth, Montego Bay, important seaport towns, Port Maria, Port Antonio, all these are traditional seaport towns. People who grew provisions, marketed the surplus, or themselves were involved in minor export crops like coffee or beeswax or honey. These Jewish retailers in these market towns were important produce dealers. They were marketed their goods, they bought their goods, and importantly, their dry goods, their provisions, the small farmers bought. So there's an important commercial nexus which developed, which quickly, depending on the circumstances, translated into a political nexus for these Jewish retailers who were ambitious for political office.
The Jews moved fairly rapidly into sort of extending their influence in the country from simply an economic base and to become part of the legislature of the country. We find that there are a number of Jews holding positions in the legislature, and their influence is so great that on one occasion the legislature actually breaks for the high Jewish holiday of Yom Kippur.
I think that was one of the highlights of our detailed history. But I mention that one to most people because it gives you an indication of not only that particular item, but it gives you an indication of how we were respected at the time and how we went into business and operated in the interest of the country very widely.
This is an era by the 1850s. The black small settlers are mobilized. They control the elections. They determine who wins. None of them qualify to run for the assembly because they don't have sufficient property. But they determine who wins the assembly elections. And at the vestry level where they're qualified, by 1857, 9 of the 10 elected vestrymen were blacks. 3 or 4 were former slaves. Many of them, of course, were artisans, blacksmiths, carpenters, masons, wheelwrights, who had acquired property, especially around the Yallas area, where it wasn't sugar really, it was pens, livestock pens, which were cut off and people were to buy lands in these new settlements around the Yallas area. The significance of 1865 is that in the aftermath of the Moambay Rebellion, the governor manipulated a panicked planter class, well-to-do whites, in some cases coloreds, who surrendered, who voted themselves out of existence, who surrendered their political powers, and Crown Colony government was introduced. The government was the governor on a pure Crown Colony government. So the coloreds, the Jews, including those commercial types, as well as the better off Jews who tend to support planters, lost their influence in politics. Up to 1865, there are around 6 or 7 Jewish shopkeepers in these new commercial towns or traditional market areas who are able to get into the assembly because they championed the causes of the free blacks and the new peasantry and the small farmers, several of whom would have been their customers. An important Jew in this trading is Arthur Abrahams. He and his brother in Port Antonio, who was elected to the assembly from Portland in 1854 because of the strong support he got from the black small farming class. You have Aaron Salome in St. Thomas in the Vale, which is today's northeastern St. Catherine. Linstead was the main market town. He wins support there, wins a seat in the assembly. David Brandon, who's a Kingston retailer and shopkeeper, wins his seat in St. Dorothy in 1860. And these people win because they champion the rights of franchise. Any attempt by the assembly to restrict the franchise, they would oppose. They champion education. Brandon, in fact, before an election, gave land for a school in Bartons in St. Catherine. They championed lower taxes on imported food provisions and also called attention for needed infrastructure, especially the road network for small farmers, as distinct to the traditional bias of fixing roads with service plantations. All right. So by 1865, you had a small but solid group over time who were elected to the assembly. So with the surrender of the Constitution, blacks lose their vote. They can't vote. Crown Colony government brings, as someone described it, as benevolent despotism at best. People who maintain their influence tend to be planters, white planters, who had a direct connection now to the ruling circles. Right. So post 1865, certainly as a political class in rural Jamaica, is the decline of the commercial, the decline of the Jewish shopkeepers and liquor retailers. Now, as a class, that class gradually in the late 19th century declines in numbers. There's Jewish migration. More and more Jews are integrating in the post-Morant Bay period, with a greater emphasis after Morant Bay, a growing strategic alliance between phenotypical whites. So you have more and more intermarriage between Jewish families, well-to-do Jewish families and white families. And gradually, certainly in the early 20th century, you find that the Chinese are emerging more and more as the new rural shopkeepers. But generally speaking, as a group, where they survive, they're surviving in more significant influence as being part of a new mercantile planter class. So you have the families in St. James and in Trelawney who are now very influential, but they have become they have invested.
Notable investments paved the way for Jewish survival in Jamaica, and the coming to fruition of these investments is a fascinating story.
So I know, for example, about the role of the Cordovers in the formation of Gleaner newspapers, the Ashnaims.
My family came out to Jamaica in 1841. The first one came out, Dr. Louis Ashenheim, because the situation out here for a Jewish person would have been so much better than if he had practiced in Europe or in England. And when he came out to Jamaica, he started a Jewish magazine called The First Fruits of the West. And in the first issue, almost on the front page of it, he said, and excuse me if I read the quote, but this I feel sums up what his feelings were for out here and why I think he will have come out here. And it says, "In no country under the sun are the blessings of toleration and of unbounded civil liberty more diffused and enjoyed by every class and every creed than in this island. What a contrast does this little colony present to the empires and monarchies of Europe. What a lesson does Jamaica, England's colony, offer to England herself, that great philanthropic and humanizing power. Still has she to erase from her statute book the last remnants of intolerance and afford her faithful and loyal Hebrew citizens free and equal participation of these civil immunities which she has not denied them in her foreign possessions.
Our family were Ashkenazi, and they lived in Breslau in Poland. And his brother went to England and won the national lottery. So he brought his brother over and built the first synagogue in London. And the two sons decided to strike out and see the New World and came to Jamaica in 1690.
1907 was a very important year and a disastrous year at the same time. We had an earthquake which damaged almost the entire city of Kingston and some of its environs. And at that time, only a very few members of our family lived here. And one of the good breaks that they got, a competition came out in the newspaper to build a theatre. Ray Nephew, Mr. Ray of Ray Nephew, put out a £200 competition for the architecture of the Ward Theatre, as it became known, but he named it after his nephew and so on. And he won that and got £200. Shortly thereafter, they put out another tender for the building of the Ward Theatre. So they bid on that as well and won it and formed a company called Henriquez Brothers Construction Company. And they went into the construction world. And they did that for a number of things, like the automotive world and various things they got in there. They got some good, we started importing cars in here in 1908 from the Ford Motor Company, and which is now recognized, that agency is now recognized as the oldest agent for Ford in the world.
Another very interesting family that became very important in the business of mass housing for people was the Matalon family. They were the first developers of mass housing schemes. Two of the men who played the most important roles in the financial system of the country was a man named O.K. Henriquez, and the other one, both dead now, was Meyer Matalon. The first Jamaican ambassador to the United States was Sir Neville Ashenheim. The first West Indian to score a century in cricket against England, in England, was Ivan Barrow. One of the interesting things that I was privileged to do was to asked by the government to chair the Jamaica National Heritage Trust, which I was able to do for some 13 years. And that was a particular privilege because I'm the first Jew that was able to have and hold that post. We also provided significant security and homes for people who were able to flee World War II's horror of the Holocaust from Germany. And we were able to house these people and allow them to practice their religions freely. And Sir Alfred de Costa was a person who had a large cattle farm and decided to test the soil on his cattle farm, and that became the founding of the aluminium site for Jamaica to become the largest producer of alumina in the world. The founding of the Hillel Academy, which took place when we had a very interesting English rabbi that was contracted to work with us in Jamaica, Rabbi Hooker, and he and one of the Matalon brothers helped in particular to found the Hillel Academy.
They have made their mark in education, in sport, in commerce, in public service, as professionals, in politics.
Richard is track and field lawyer and a track and field person. Of course, Chris Blackwell's mother, the Lindas from St. Mary in banana, sugar, rum, that sort of thing.
I happen to have been Minister of Development, and it was my job to deal with the waterfront and the UDC, how to create the UDC. But in doing so, I needed someone who was knowledgeable, understood what he was doing, and very smart. And I picked Moses Matalon. No, I never knew Moses before, I just knew the family. And Moses turned out to be a fantastic addition to the team. In fact, he was the leader of the team. And that helped us a lot in dealing with the New Kingston waterfront, the Kingston waterfront.
I don't look at Jamaica as the contribution of Jews to Jamaica. It's the contribution of Jamaicans to Jamaica.
Our motto, out of many one people, is in fact a beautiful motto. It also embraces the fundamental tenets of Judaism. One God who created so many.
It was a religion that stood beside Anglicans and Baptists and Seventh-day and so on. It was just another religion. We were all Jamaicans.
I think that Jamaica is a microcosm of the future in terms of race relations, religious tolerance, all these sorts of things. You don't hang on to the us versus them. There's utter respect, and there's also interest and curiosity. We have the Archbishop coming to the synagogue. We have Jewish community leaders going to churches. There's no sense of being disloyal to who you are, to actually to be curious and to embrace what other people are about.
Well, I think that anti-Semitism was small because there were very few Jews there. And there wasn't the competition that Jews created and caused the anti-Semitism.
It didn't make me think that I was totally different. I just felt like I was another guy.
My experience is that when I see people being stereotyped, or they look at me and say, I come to the synagogue, I see you and you're doing all the chants in Hebrew and all that. I didn't know that Jamaica had Jews. So I said, why? You don't look like one. So I said, my retort has always been, what is the color of a Jew? And they stopped in exactly. So they start to scratch their head. Because you see, you have to completely destroy these stereotypes. And people don't think. Well, you know, I've been asked the question so many times that I say to myself, that's the only retort. Because if I were white, they would not have asked that question.
When this question of Jewishness comes up, people say to me, how come you're Jewish? You don't look like a Jew. So I would say, what does a Jew look like? Oh, you know, like I have straight hair and white skin and blue eye. I say, I say, you read the Bible? Yes. Say, you read the Bible well? Yes. So you know about Egypt? Yes. And these places? Yes. I say, what color people come from that side of the world?
Growing up Jewish, going to Catholic school, having a nanny who practiced a bit of obia and was a Seventh-day Adventist at the same time, I have a whole pile of influences. I have a stepmother who has a ton of superstitions about not putting shoes on the bed and handbags on the ground, and every time something was built, you had to spill blood, cut off chickens' heads. So, you know, as a child, you don't really differentiate between one and the other. It all becomes part of your whole spirituality, of belief systems, of, you know, and also tolerance for everything else that goes along with that. Because if you are allowing the workmen to cut a chicken's head off and spill blood on your property, whether you believe it or not, it's also saying I respect their points of view and I'm supporting what they need to do. So I had all of that going on.
There is lots of Jews living here in Jamaica. They don't even know what is it to be a Jew. It's a responsibility.
It's almost a sense of tribalism, a sense of belonging, a sense of my heritage, my roots, of understanding where I come from.
I actually was disillusioned with Christianity, and I started to ask some questions about, you know, about existence, life, why am I here? Judaism calls faith to action through practice. It's not like, you know, you divorce faith and practice, but they they work together to add meaning and order to your life. So it's called for Tikkun Olam, which is really drawing from the divine to heal the world or to better the world, you know, through acts of loving kindness and justice.
I was not raised Jewish, so nothing about Judaism was attractive to me at the time. When I became older, I met a man who was interested in my Jewish background. He researched my genealogy, and when I looked at the genealogy, I could see that my heritage stretched back for over 350 years, that this was a 350-year history. And how come it broke in my generation? How come I was not a Jew? So although now I converted when I was 26, and I've been a Jew for 30 years now, I'm still a Jamaican Jew. And I did a mikvah. A mikvah is the ritual bath when you immerse yourself. Immersing in the bath was the real time of giving over.
I'm racially black, but I am also religiously Jew. And I find them not incompatible, but looking at it in a way of trying to find a deeper meaning of who I am has convinced me that it's a blessing to be a Jew, to be a Sephardim Jew, to be a Mendez, and to have both heritages.
I don't believe in the religion per se, but the one thing I do believe is that my religious education was a good thing. It gave me a good moral compass for the world ahead.
Welcome to the Falmouth Jewish Cemetery. My name is Marina Delfas. I am co-owner and director of Falmouth Heritage Walks. I have been looking after this cemetery since 2011, and in 2013 I decided to create a tour underneath my walking tour company so we could raise funds to help maintain the cemetery, as a lot of people have found it to be an interesting site, not only just for their interest in Jewish history, but because they're descended from some of the persons buried here, so for genealogical purposes. There are a number of well-known Jamaicans here. The first Ashanime that came to Jamaica is buried here. Also, the Lindo family here, many Delissers here. There is the famous Nathan department store in downtown Kingston, his ancestors here. The oldest Jewish tombstone, as far as we know, is 1672, located at Hunts Bay. That was a clearly Sephardic cemetery. You see there's not much English on the tombstones. The tombstones either have Hebrew, they have Hebrew usually at the top, and then at the bottom it's either Spanish or Portuguese, because that was the language they used, their mother tongue. And as they resided more in Jamaica, you'd find that there would be trilingual tombstones in Hunts Bay.
Thank you. The history of Jewish life in Jamaica is also kept alive in the memories of those who grew up Jewish. And despite the threats to Judaism in Jamaica today, both practicing and non-practicing Jews hold on dearly to these memories.
I found it really exotic because when I went to the synagogue, it was a high holy day, and it was full, and the women were all upstairs. And I must say, they looked very exotic to me. You know, sort of like olive skin, eyes. I mean, they really looked not like people I knew from Miami. When I grew up, most of the people were, if not immigrants, were first generation. We're here suddenly in Jamaica, the guys were big, you know, big guys, strong, all wearing Hamburgs, tuxedos to go to these services. And I found the thing extremely interesting.
In the days gone by, the synagogue would be packed jam. No seats. You have to come early to get a seats, and they put chairs in the passage and fill it up for people to come in.
The women, when I was little, were still required to sit upstairs. I think they were still second-class citizens, although basically they ran the homes. So this must have been a cultural inheritance. So the upstairs of the synagogue, if you go there now, which is largely empty, used to be filled with the women. Now that has changed. You know, there are a lot of women directors of the synagogue. But even that has been within the last 10 years. So I remember sitting upstairs first. Later that changed. I remember finding the rabbi very boring.
There were 2,000 of us then. Now we have what, 100, 150? Synagogue is empty. On a Friday night, when we go, sometimes it's 10, 15, 20 the most. So it's problematic.
The younger generation, they're only looking about the games and the sports on that Saturday. They're not coming to service. And as the older parents used to sit to it every Saturday, they had to come, had to be ready to come to Sabbath school every Saturday. That's our generation. Now the children have their sports and that, so they're not coming.
But what are some of the reasons that account for the dwindling numbers in the Jewish community today? And what hope is there for the future?
Duke Street, which was a street that was full of law practices, a lot of them left. And people in other forms of business. Because you see, over the eras, they had become accustomed to being moved around. And so when you settle yourself and looking through the corner of your eye as to where you're going to go next, so when the time comes, you don't have to discern that. So they moved out quickly because the economy was so wrecked at the time. You didn't have the need for so much skilled people to do work. So it didn't really impact on us as much at the beginning. It was when we started to grow again. And you say, where can I find so? So it's gone.
The Jewish community of Jamaica has diminished to an almost unsustainable level. And much of our congregation today are descendants of mixed marriages, mixed relationships. Fathers Christian, mothers Jewish, and vice versa. And they themselves, as I was, breaking the barriers 50-odd years ago, married to a non-Jew.
The migration began before the 70s. So many people moved then, and I think not just the Jewish community. I would have felt it necessary to migrate too. It was too frightening. And the prospect of a communist takeover was very, very real and very close.
People were staying indoors. There were very little lights. In fact, it was the most extraordinary phenomenon. The day after the election, when Michael was bailed out, suddenly when we drove over, lights, people in the streets, people coming out. So things had really come to a very drastic situation.
Oh, yes. So I think this was what really emptied out the synagogue to a great extent, which was a great pity. A few came back. You'd be surprised. More the children of the families that left. They had good remembrances of Jamaica, and many of them have come back, but not enough to repopulate the Jewish community. So it's going to be very interesting to see what happens to Judaism in Jamaica.
The future of the Jewish community is something that I am concerned about, because when people like me drop out, I think the community is going to do the same thing too.
As a result of the changes in the economies of other countries and the opportunity for subsequent educational facilities, which were limited in Jamaica, a large number of our younger people started to migrate to study. And today, the size of our population is of great concern.
And our worst problem is that we are not converting people.
I worry that if this Jewish community dies out and it's on a huge decline. You have to sort of wonder, in 30 years' time, will it even exist? And it's difficult to see it existing even as it is now. And it's getting more and more dissipated, you know. More Jewish boys or Jewish girls are marrying out of the religion, and that waters it down a bit more. And you know, I mean, I can't complain. I did it myself. I'm part of that decline, but that's the world we live in. You know, if I came back in 30 years' time, is there going to be a Friday night service, a Saturday morning service? I don't know.
I can't say surviving because right now our population is well over 60, most of us. And the younger people, again, what do they know about their religion? Very little. In fact, I've always said that no Jew can become a Christian. Basically, I talk about the Jewish Christian people. The only person who can never leave their religion is someone who has a Sabbath school mentality. They went to Sabbath school, and that's about all. They don't understand their religion. They've never focused on learning about it or in getting involved in its history. So the future is not good. The future is not good.
The other part of the equation of being non-sustainable is that the practice of Judaism requires, on the Sabbath, to read the Torah to 10 people. Now, in Orthodox Judaism, that's 10 men who have been bar mitzvah. In Jamaica, we gave up the gender difference years and years and years ago, from the days when I was president. So women are included in that 10. And we are now finding it difficult to find 10 people to come to synagogue on a Sabbath morning to be able to read Torah.
I think that Judaism has a lot of tradition in it in Jamaica. There's also the translation. Now, as a child, this bothered me terribly. I didn't like it, so I can perfectly well understand why children and young people would not be interested.
Notwithstanding the threats to the Jewish community and the practice of Judaism in Jamaica, there is still hope for the future. Hope for survival in a place where they belong.
This was one of the reasons why the whole idea of the Jewish community starting a school was to have something other than just going to services as a reason to coalesce. And I think it is, in a way, served that purpose, is the interest in the Hillel Academy, the interest in being part of something bigger. And it's been a very interesting situation. So I think things are changing, and I'm encouraged. I see a lot of kids that seem to show up from time to time at services.
I teach Star Club at Hillel Academy, and I've done so for about 20-odd years. And we meet once a week, and we have varying amounts of students that come. We open the club to not just the Jewish kids, but any kids in Hillel or anywhere else who'd like to join and learn about Judaism. We make crafts, we sing songs, we learn about the festivals, and we try to get a little Hebrew in. And it's sort of like the groundwork, the foundation of what the kids will need to move on to become bar mitzvah or bat mitzvah.
I would not begin to predict what would happen. We know we have a lot of young people coming up. Some will stay, some will go, like everywhere. We have still a decent population of older people. Not old people like me, older people. And one of the things I have to say about that is that one of the things, if you all the time we have talked about the Jews and so on, the one thing I think you hope that you have noticed, we don't give up. We will continue. Margaret is an authority on the subject, my daughter.
I'm absolutely optimistic. I'm hopeful. I have a lot of hope. This year we have children from abroad who have come to the school and come to Jamaica And the next thing you know, your numbers are up, and it's like, wow. It's almost like an answer to your prayers.
I am confident that the good name of Judaism, of our families who have been here during the days of slavery, emancipation, independence, colonial rule and independence, who have contributed to the building of this country, that good name will prevail.
Jewish DNA is going to exist in Jamaicans until Jamaica is no longer. Jewish influence in terms of culture, in terms of how Jamaica itself, especially Kingston, was formulated. The heritage, the roots, the foundation will always be there. But like everything else on this planet, everything is transforming, and nothing is going to be as it was, and we can't expect it to be. We can only expect it to get better. And if that means giving up the strict, rigid rules of religion, of societies, and becoming more integrated and more tolerant and more about oneness, then how can that be a bad thing?
Well, we're trying everything. We try everything. I can't do anything more as I can't get move around. But nurse will tell you I'm doing my part. There's hope for everything, and prayers. So that's it. We won't die. We won't die. There will be one left.
Don't turn the lights out yet. The United Congregation of Israelites are embarking on a program which has 4 pillars of growth. The first one being to look into the 424,000 Jamaicans who have Jewish lineage and offering them membership to the United Congregation of Israelites. We're doing this by introducing them to the historical data, such as this program, and others which will encourage them to form part and parcel of the society. The second one, we are looking at bringing a Reform rabbi into Jamaica, whose duty it will be to encourage and deal with the rebirth of the new congregants. The third one is the introduction of all our Jewish sites as religious tourism locations, where people can come and visit our synagogue, visit the Heritage Center, visit our famous cemeteries, of which the Hunts Bay is the most famous. The fourth pillar of growth is Hillel Academy, which is now 50 years old. We are planning to build a multi-purpose type arena and a fine arts center, along with the Star Club building, which will deal with the future growth and development of our Jewish children. We think that we should be successful in the rebirth of our new community going forward.
It's very important to tell the history of who we are and where we came from. It's not just about the Jews in Jamaica. It's about Jews all over the world.
It's a very interesting set of people with a very long history, fleeing from persecution in many instances, and being able to establish and practice Judaism freely in Jamaica for over 360 years. Because of the way that the history has been recorded in the families, orally, as opposed to with facts and proper research. And why this documentary is very, very important.
And it's through our history that our light, our perpetual lamp, will continue to burn and continue to be as a symbol for other people in other communities, that we can coexist, we can survive, and we can prosper.